Hello there, everyone. So you may remember last commentary where I responded to a video created by a user going by the screen name of Rational Outlaw, attempting to rebut an earlier video I made, criticizing the idea of minarchism in general, as you may have seen.
For one, a government doesn't have to insert theft. Not all forms of taxation are theft or extortion.
Yeah, my low expectation going into this video was realized in that this channel is just another example of Killian's Law.
You rang?
Oh, hey Shane, I was just talking about you.
You don't say, 'cause that's not at all why I came by.
Yeah, I was just about to explain Killian's Law, but since you coined the term, you want to go ahead?
Sure, my viewers gave it that name years ago after I observed it. Killian's Law says that the more prominently a positive trait appears in a self-identifier, the less likely it is to actually apply.
Well, Rational Outlaw...
Oh, great example! Rational is a positive character trait, so he's less likely to be rational. Outlaw, on the other hand...
Oh, so you'd be willing to help out here? Because I'm talking about him again, this time going over broader problems with his argumentation specifically, instead of his stated philosophy, as well as responding to a video of his.
Oh yeah? Which video?
Well, a while ago, Filthy Heretic made a video responding to Rational Outlaw, which was a response to his series that was a response to common justifications for government police and the state's role in enforcing legislative fiat within state societies. Rational Outlaw, in turn, made a response video attempting to rebut Filthy's arguments. Needless to say, that it's Outlaw's worst video by far. It's so bad that it highlights the argumentative flaws in all of his other videos, which I otherwise likely wouldn't have noticed, turning this single response into a two-part series, explaining the problems with his philosophy in part 1, and now going over the specific video which I initially wanted to talk about in part 2.
Wait, so this is a response to a response to a response, which itself was a response to a response?
That's right. Do you think you can handle the autism?
If I didn't, would I even have a channel?
A bad cop enforces unjust legislation. All cops take an oath to enforce all legislation. Most legislation is unjust. All cops are bad cops. Police who enforce unjust legislation are bad people. After all, they're victimizing people who cannot be objectively proven to have done anything wrong.
Yes, I agree, they're arresting people who haven't done anything objectively wrong.
Okay, we agree.
However, most of society doesn't see that. You're going to have to convince society to change in order for them to see it as wrong.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Yeah, that was too obvious. Shame on me for even trying to pull that gag.
Don't feel bad, I've done it twice myself. Basically what he's doing is a pretty major argumentum ad populum. To put it simply, if a lot of people believe something, it must be right. But the earth wasn't really flat back when most people thought it was. By the same token, questions of ethics aren't reliant on what most people believe. It wasn't too many centuries ago that most people believed that slavery was okay. It was still a horribly unethical practice.
This is what I was explaining in the last episode about outlaws and other so-called minarchist misunderstanding of what a government is, how it functions, and incentives governments have along with the relationship between the state and non-state actors. The only way they can justify their misunderstandings is by appealing to fallacious arguments. This is pretty common with minarchist arguments. In fact, I would argue the minarchist position itself is conceived of because of these widespread misconceptions regarding the nature of what the state is.
Yeah, and that's what I keep running into. It boils down to a question of, is it still a state if it doesn't initiate force? If you don't think there should be any barriers to someone attempting to set up a service that competes with the state, you're actually an anarchist, not a minarchist.
So, this isn't an issue unique with Outlaw, and this is pretty much the only part of the video I can safely say that about, so don't get used to this. The main issue here is that he's conflating the mere concept of a society and the existence of a state. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time here going over the problems with this particular point, the collective interest all government agencies have as being a part of a single organization, the obvious and necessary disconnect in incentives between people who run the state and people who don't, an example being how the government obtains its resources, showing that states on a fundamental basis operate against the interests of non-state actors regardless of their relative preferences, and I could go on. But I covered these already in great detail in the first part, which will be linked in the pinned comment if you haven't already seen it. If you haven't figured it out, it would probably help you quite a bit to watch part 1 first, though it's not necessary.
But I do find it genuinely perplexing. Humans have existed on Earth and have communicated with other humans for something like 500,000 years. States are a relatively recent phenomenon. They've only existed for like 5,500 years. But we know that intercontinental trade routes have existed for at least 80,000 years, and that would have required a very complex level of social organization on a broad scale. There are stateless societies which have existed since states have come into the picture, which have had complex organizations such as specialized trade, property rights, arbitration, and everything which statists claim the state needs to exist, such as Cospaia in Italy or Tron in Mexico.
So, aside from the fact that we can easily prove this claim to be demonstrably wrong with archaeological and historical evidence, most, if not all, human action occurs in spite of the existence of the state. For instance, to trade with anyone in any manner for any reason under any circumstances according to U.S. federal law would be illegal if the legal code were to be consistently followed to the state, or at least interpreted as it's written. It's illegal to sell anything at a lower price than any other sellers because that's predatory pricing. It's illegal to sell commodities at a higher price because that's monopolistic business practice, and it's illegal for anyone to sell commodities at the same price because that's conspiracy. On top of that, many quote-unquote laws are deliberately written to be so subjective that how they're enforced, where and when, is essentially dependent solely on the situational discretion of the police and courts. For example, disturbing the peace, interfering with a police investigation, or, my personal favorite, being under arrest for resisting arrest. Then there are things I already mentioned in the last video, such as legislation itself being impossible even conceptually to be enforced around a consistent standard due to how information is conveyed and internalized being relative to each individual person, or how the fact that people can be aggressed upon without a victim by the state shows that the state in function has separate interests from both the victims and criminals in arbitration, or the mere fact that states fund themselves through parasitic and coercive means.
So even if you just sat around and did nothing until you shriveled up and died, you still wouldn't be able to consistently follow the state's legislative fiat. And despite this, there's an observable constant in the state's general interest in enforcing it. Plus, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt, human incentives are influenced by their relative perception of how scarce resources are, how difficult it is to secure their own assets, the perceived interests of those around them, and other things.
So culture and social structures are the general sum of human action within a particular area or broader organization, and government is provably antagonistic towards human action in a plentiful number of ways, more than I could or should even mention in this single video. The idea, therefore, that the legislation of a state is a product of culture is not very compelling, to say the least.
I don't think when people do something wrong, necessarily a bad person. Quite frankly, the term bad person or evil person is probably used way too much. And I'm also guilty of this. I have used evil and bad person on people when I probably shouldn't have.
I don't know about you, but I think most everyone else, consider those who beat, kill, rob, and kidnap people to be amoral at best. To do all of that in order to further the interests of an organization which actively sinks the population they subjugate deeper into poverty? They have to be the most morally reprehensible people. Also, way to cut off Filthy's original argument right before his conclusion.
While all police do take an oath to enforce unjust legislation, many don't. For this, they deserve our thanks for achieving the bare minimum of socially acceptable behavior. But this just means they won't do their job. So cops either enforce unjust legislation, which makes them bad people, or they don't, which makes them bad cops. Pick one.
So this is the main reason why I was interested in responding to this video. I almost don't even care about the particular subject. I just find it reprehensible how fucking disingenuous he is throughout this entire video, and quite revealing simultaneously. He omitted the entire conclusion of the argument which Filthy was attempting to establish in order to avoid having to address it, and in order to present Filthy's point as something different, something weaker than it actually was. To reiterate, Filthy's actual argument was that the morality of each individual police officer is irrelevant because as someone who works for the government as a police officer, their job is to enforce the state's decrees with the threat of violence. If they don't, then they aren't doing their job by definition of what their job is. So regardless of your views on the legitimacy of political rule, because of this, you're left in a dilemma with two possible choices. Either trying to support the position that everything the government has ever done or ever could do is 100% ethically valid, or that police officers are criminals. The former position is one of the few things that everyone seems to agree isn't true, regardless of their view of the state or the nature of logic in general, including Outlaw himself, as he's conceded in this very video. And Outlaw presumably would feel too uncomfortable openly defending what he would have to acknowledge to be a criminal organization if you were to take the latter point. And rightfully so, because he's claimed to be a natural law proponent on various occasions, including his response to the straw man version of Filthy's argument in this very video.
Yes, I agree they're arresting people who haven't done anything objectively wrong.
Yeah, if you have to resort to that level of intellectual dishonesty, I have to wonder if even you believe you have any valid points to make. So we're left with the conclusion that Outlaw selectively omitted Filthy explaining his actual position because acknowledging it would have either forced Outlaw into an indefensible position or forced him to agree with Filthy that police agencies are criminal organizations. Now, believe it or not, I usually give people the benefit of the doubt in situations like this because I can't tell what their motivations are for sure. But in this case, it's not only obvious, it's also not the only time he did it. Notice that every time he omits a portion of Filthy's video, it conveniently happens to be a section which was crucial to the full context of Filthy's argument. And so Outlaw ends up responding to a complete straw man. And so when he gets to things Filthy addresses later in the video, he can respond with an argument that Filthy had already rebutted. For example, in the section immediately after this one, this happens.
That you had to say, for the most part, at the end, tells me everything I need to know. You know what's going on. They do kill people en masse.
What I was saying there was that there are some cops who do commit murder, there are some cops who do commit theft, all these crimes that are horrendous. I was not saying that they were committing murder or theft en masse. That was not my intention, if that's how you interpreted it.
Good God, where to even begin? Well, firstly, that's not even close to Heretic's actual argument, and literally all you have to do is watch the original video with this segment in its initial context to see this.
If they were beating people and killing people and stealing from people en masse, then yeah, you could have a leg to stand on. But they're not, for the most part.
That you had to say, for the most part, at the end, tells me everything I need to know. You know what's going on. They do kill people en masse. They are beating people en masse, stealing from people, and you know they are, just not for the most part. Trouble is that en masse is an arbitrary standard that's made for shifting goalposts. How will I know when the murder rate of cockroaches is en masse? It's a useless standard, meant to deflect the cognitive dissonance I'm certain Rational Outlaw is experiencing. He knows full well that cops steal, murder, and assault, but by creating the arbitrary standard of en masse, or, for the most part, he can give the impression to us, and to himself, that it's really not as bad of a problem as I and other cockroach critics make it out to be, and therefore not a problem worth examining or stopping. This allows the problem of sociopaths being given effective exemptions from legislation against assault, battery, theft, rape, and murder go on, safely ignored.
Do I even need to comment? Outlaw removed the clip which Filthy was originally responding to, and then Outlaw responds, quote-unquote, to something he basically just made up on the spot. Anyone can tell that he omitted this argument specifically to misrepresent Filthy's original claim, because he goes on multiple times throughout this video to argue against Filthy's points by attempting to use the exact tactic which Filthy had just explained was fallacious. In other words, Outlaw, you left his explanation out deliberately because it kneecapped you and put you into a position where you were unable to defend your side of the argument, which tells me that you're not approaching us in good faith.
And this isn't the only video on Outlaw's channel where he dishonestly mischaracterizes the subject's original claims and/or misrepresents their arguments. I'll just slip in a link to one of my own videos where I respond to him doing exactly the same thing to me. The really sad part is, even after he's completely strawmanned the other person to his liking, he still fails at basic argumentation. In most of his responses, he simply asserts that his position is correct or that the subject's is incorrect without even attempting to elaborate or explain why.
It's like my first channel if my content, ideas, and argumentation were to have never improved.
Oh, I shudder to think. In fact, I'm gonna get out of here before things get any worse. Smell you later!
Good idea, and really, I don't even necessarily know if I need to continue at this point, but I think that I will because Outlaw goes on to egregiously play with statistics, and as a result, I feel as if this video wouldn't be complete without it.
Most interactions with the police have no use of force involved at all. Specifically speaking, only 1% of police interactions require any force.
This is what makes this argument so dangerous. If their criminality rate was as low, if not lower, than the average American, then Outlaw might have had a point.
Except it is, quite drastically. The number of people arrested for violent crime in America for a regular citizen is 160.7 per 100,000 residents. While specifically looking at cops, it's 1.7 per 100,000.
Great. So you understand that cockroaches, or more specifically US cockroaches, are the most murderous demographic in the world by a huge margin.
Except they're not, at least specifically in the United States.
You understand that 40% of cockroach spouses are victims of domestic abuse.
That stat is false. There's no good study that says 40% of police officers abuse their families or their spouses.
So, regarding the claim about police and domestic violence, Outlaw provides a link to a paper published in 2013 by Bowling Green University, and it's very obvious based on the fact that he cited this paper to prove this claim. He never actually read this paper beyond the first sentence, because the paper does not assert that the 40% figure is overblown as Outlaw seems to be insinuating. The arguments which the paper establishes are as follows. For one, there's the fact that the figure we have was based on self-report surveys collected by various random police departments all across the United States, which is pretty self-evidently unreliable. Most police officers are probably not going to tell the police departments they work for that they've been abusing their families, because that has the potential to ruin their livelihoods. And the families of officers can't be relied upon to report an abuser, because there's the threat that doing so would result in even more abuse, plus the psychological conditions family members can develop, such as Stockholm Syndrome or battered wife syndrome, due to the fact that leaving an abuser or actually reporting their abuse is associated with a dramatic cost in one's own well-being, depending on the role said abuser plays in the family. And we're talking about an abuser who's an active police officer by default. They bring home the income, more likely than not, and maintain some sense of asset stability for the other members of the household. Because of the way these surveys collect their information, we know by default that the proclaimed number of reports are not going to accurately represent the total amount of police officers who abuse their family members, because the methodology these studies use to collect data actively discourages the information these surveys are trying to collect from being conveyed. Then there's the fact that the actual reports are given to internal affairs units from police departments, which means that they are legally the property of internal affairs. Therefore, it's impossible to ever conduct a somewhat scientific study on this issue, because the information necessary to do so will never be publicly available. What his paper actually establishes is that the 40% figure is just based on what's available. And there are several things we can point to which logically suggest that the real number of police officers that have abused their family members is probably much higher, but we'll never know the exact data because the only information we can base our studies off of are based on surveys published by the government, which seem to be deliberately designed to produce a conclusion which results in a drastic underrepresentation. And the actual reports are basically classified, so we can't even measure the figures published by the studies against actual incidents, because we have no way of knowing how many actual incidents have occurred. The fact that despite all of these deliberate efforts to massage the data and reach a conclusion which is as small of a number as possible, the final figure is still 40% is pretty telling in and of itself. And I started with this study because it's the only one which doesn't rely on equating incompatible subjects using misleading euphemisms or playing with different arbitrary frameworks to deliberately misconstrue the data being conveyed, and using vaguely defined parameters to either create overblown or underrepresented figures based on relative convenience for the state. The figure that 1% of active duty police interactions involve force comes from a study published by the U.S. Department of Justice in October of 1999, simply entitled Use of Force by Police, and this data can be immediately discredited after simply taking a quick glance at how the DOJ defined their terms. Firstly, the paper defines an appropriate example of a situation where force can be used as any time a police officer is arresting someone, quote, restraining unruly combatants, or, quote, controlling a disruptive demonstration, and what defines a use of force as being justified or unjustified, as you may have guessed, is based around the amount of physical force used. So, right off the bat, the study has already revealed its premise to be a bait and switch. What's being considered an act of aggression here for this paper's data is not whether or not force was initiated or someone was coerced, as the title and introduction of the paper suggests. Its data is based on whether or not the state deems the force used to be excessive or not, which is an entirely arbitrary standard the paper doesn't even attempt to contextualize or explain what it means. This is aside from the fact that, like the minarchists' arguments of government being more or less justified based on the scale around which they operate, it conceptually doesn't make any sense to determine whether or not the use of force is justified based on how much force is used, because this would require the use of force in question to be compared to another, which is both not relevant to the specific instance being analyzed between two parties. Therefore, if there wasn't another use of force to be compared, this standard couldn't work. But here, there are even more issues. For instance, what is the context according to this framework in which I can compare the use of force to another? Can I compare shooting someone in self-defense during a robbery to shooting someone in self-defense if they tried to assault said person? How do we measure the scale of force? Can I only use my hands to stop a robber, but I'm justified in using a gun to stop someone trying to assault me? What about comparing different means used to stop someone? How do you translate using fists to using bullets? Is excessive force measured in the velocity of my fist striking a robber's face? Does it differentiate between striking in the face or striking the chest? If such a sliding scale exists, then surely Rational Outlaw must have an objective and universal answer he can point to, otherwise we can conclude that this assertion is false. Secondly, the examples listed for what an appropriate time for force to be used is even more broad and arbitrary. 2 of the 3 listed criteria don't even mean anything. What constitutes as a combatant? What does unruly mean? And what is meant by the use of the word restraining? This could apply to anything from shooting a maniac charging at a cop with a knife in their hand to a cop emptying their entire clip by shooting at a 15-year-old unprovoked who's running away from them. The same thing can be said for controlling a disruptive demonstration. Hell, these 2 phrases are so euphemistic and vague that they could be used interchangeably to describe the exact same things. As for the use of force being appropriate for arrests, the state creates legal codes specifically so that police can cite them as a justification for initiating force against someone who otherwise didn't do anything, as mentioned earlier. But just in general, as a coercive monopoly on arbitration, the legislative fiat issued by political rulers is entirely arbitrary. This plays onto a criticism I had in part 1 of the state in general, where because of this, it's not possible in a framework which accepts political rule as legitimate to even have a consistent standard of what is justified or unjustified. This paper presents another perfect example of how the core arguments for statism just don't work from a standpoint of basic observation. If the premises for this paper were to be taken at face value, then it would be impossible for legislative fiat to be illegitimate, even though by nature, legislative fiat is entirely arbitrary and the standards of what does or doesn't count as a legitimate use of force are also defined exclusively by the state. So, in state societies, whether or not law is enforced or what counts as law is entirely arbitrary. Because of this, the only way you'd be able to even approach creating an accurate figure for the amount of police who've coerced people would be to reject the notion that political rule can be legitimate. Otherwise, it's impossible to collect data which isn't entirely based around flippant, meaningless standards. Just to show you how inaccurate this paper is, Philip Brailsford, the mass murderer who used a pro-gamer move and became a cop to avoid being held accountable for killing and beating people, who was recorded murdering someone on camera by shooting them multiple times while they were on their hands and knees. That incident would not have been considered a use of force by the standards laid out in this study. So we can safely say that it's bullshit. The last paper Outlaw cites is regarding the percentage of police arrested for committing violent crimes relative to the rest of the population, put out by the DOJ in 2016. Well, given that the state has control over what is or isn't considered a crime, who is arrested, and who is convicted of their crimes, naturally, state actors generally are going to end up underrepresented in stats like this, given that they have a direct structural incentive to keep the numbers as low as possible. This aside, the paper in question uses fucking Google News as a source. No, not just Google, but the articles which Google prioritizes and places in their news section when you search any specific subject under that tab. Do I even need to comment on that? Anyway, that's all for today's video. Normally I'd be doing patron questions here, but I haven't received any recently, though thankfully I do have an announcement instead. On the 18th of December, I and Filthy Heretic are going to be doing a live debate against Rational Outlaw himself and the Dark Conservatarian on the subject of minarchy and libertarianism. Anyway, we'll see you all then.